If you had the ability to go back in time, even just a few hours, what would you do? Fix a mistake? Relive a moment? Save a life? Well, in the wizarding world, you'd probably just use it to attend extra classes. That's right. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Hermione Granger is given one of the most powerful magical objects in existence, the Time Turner. And it's not to prevent Voldemort's rise, rescue innocent people, or stop mass murderers. No, it's so she can take arithmancy and ancient runes at the same time. It's like giving someone a nuclear launch code just to make sure they don't miss piano lessons. The problem with the Time Turner isn't just the absurdity of the Ministry of Magic trusting a 13-year-old with time travel. It's the implications of introducing such a device at all. Once the possibility of rewinding time exists, the entire logic of the series unravels. If this thing works, then why not go back to the night Voldemort attacked the Potters and stop him? Why not save Cedric Diggory from the graveyard? Rescue Sirius permanently instead of sending him on the run, or replay the Battle of Hogwarts until everyone survives. The existence of the Time Turner makes every later tragedy feel preventable, which undercuts the stakes of the entire story. Now, fans have tried to patch this hole. Some insist that time in Rowling's world is fixed. You can't change events, only fulfill what has already happened, which is why Harry sees himself casting the Patronus by the lake. Others argue that time turners are so heavily regulated that their use is practically impossible outside of special cases. And we're told later they were all destroyed in the Department of Mysteries anyway. But this only raises another question. If they're so dangerous, why did the Ministry casually hand one to a student in the first place? The more honest explanation, the one most fans reluctantly admit, is that Rowling introduced the Time Turner as a clever twist in Book 3, then realized she had broken her own universe and needed to quietly sweep it under the rug. That's why the devices are destroyed and never mentioned again. Before we dive into the hidden cracks of the wizarding world, I've got a request for you. If you're ready to explore 30 of the biggest plot holes and contradictions in Harry Potter, loopholes that will forever change the way you see the series, then hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter of this deep dive. This isn't just a story about Harry Potter, it's a story about the magic, the mistakes, and the mysteries that keep us talking decades later. So grab your butterbeer, settle in, and let's unravel the wizarding world together. The real problem is that once the Time Turner is used to save Sirius and Buckbeak, it proves that outcomes can be changed. Dumbledore, who knows about the device, suddenly has no excuse. He could have prevented countless deaths and tragedies, but chose not to. It's like having a boss who knows there's a big red button in the office that can fix every mistake, yet only uses it to rearrange the meeting schedule. The Time Turner wasn't just a plot device. It was a Pandora's box that cracked the internal logic of the story wide open. And while Rowling tried to slam the lid shut by destroying them all, it was too late. Every time a beloved character dies, Cedric, Fred, Remus, Tonks, readers can't help but think, if only Hermione still had that necklace, things could have turned out differently. Time is supposed to heal all wounds, but in the Harry Potter universe, it just creates bigger ones. Of course, time travel isn't the only magical tool that bends logic in the wizarding world. If the Time Turner opened one door too many, the Polyjuice Potion throws the whole castle wide open. First introduced in Chamber of Secrets, it's one of the most ambitious and complex potions ever brewed, requiring a month-long process and some rare ingredients. The idea is simple. Drink it, and you transform into someone else, taking on their exact appearance. In theory, it should only be a skin-deep disguise, a mask that fools the eye but not the voice or the mannerisms. Yet, when Harry and Ron gulp it down to impersonate Crabbe and Goyle, the transformation seems to go far beyond looks. Their voices change too, perfectly matching their disguises. No need for practice, no need for acting lessons. The potion even handles the vocal cords, and that is where the loophole opens wide. If Polyjuice changes voices as well as bodies, why is it ever difficult for imposters to pull off their disguises? Later in the series, when Barty Crouch Jr. uses it to impersonate Mad-Eye Moody, the deception is flawless, but that's chalked up to his skill and cunning. If the potion really works as it did for Harry and Ron, then even the clumsiest impersonator could fool anyone. To make matters worse, Harry, Ron, and Hermione use the potion multiple times throughout the series, and the rules seem to change whenever it suits the plot. Sometimes it makes them sound like the person. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it fools everyone easily, while other times it requires elaborate acting. Rowling never draws a clear line, and because of that, the potion becomes less of a consistent magical formula and more of a narrative Swiss Army knife, flexible enough to solve whatever problem the characters face at the moment. Fans often try to justify this by pointing to the complexity of brewing the potion, suggesting maybe its effects vary depending on how well it's prepared. A perfectly brewed batch could theoretically handle the voice as well, while a rushed or sloppy version might leave traces of the original speaker. But that doesn't hold up when you realize Hermione, the most meticulous of all, was the one responsible for the batches we saw. If anyone was going to make it right, it would be her. Others claim the potion adapts based on intent, as if magic itself wants the transformation to succeed. But this explanation feels more like an excuse than a rule. What really seems to be happening is simple. Rowling used Polyjuice as a narrative shortcut. Need Harry to sneak into the Slytherin common room? Polyjuice need the trio to infiltrate the Ministry. Polyjuice need to have Death Eaters disguised as ordinary folk at a wedding. You guessed it. But the more it shows up, the more it stretches believability. Imagine how dangerous this potion would be if widely used. Ministry officials could be replaced at any moment. Bank vaults at Gringotts could be infiltrated with ease. No one's identity could ever be trusted, and society itself would collapse under the weight of constant impersonation. And yet, in the wizarding world, it seems to be treated as just another clever trick. This slippery inconsistency makes Polyjuice less of a potion and more of a plot convenience. It works however Rowling needs it to work, changing not just appearances but entire personalities when the story demands it, and conveniently leaving gaps when it doesn't. Much like the Time Turner, it raises the question of why it isn't used constantly in the larger battles against Voldemort. Why sneak into Death Eater meetings when you could simply drink the right potion and sit at the table unnoticed? Why risk lives in direct duels when a disguise could end the conflict before it even begins? The Time Turner taught us that time itself could have saved lives, and Polyjuice teaches us that identity itself could have ended wars. Both tools prove too powerful for the story to handle, and so they are bent, trimmed, and quietly ignored whenever they threaten to overshadow the plot. And as we move deeper into the magical inconsistencies of Rowling's world, another spell rises to the surface, one that might be even more baffling than time travel or shape-shifting. It is a single incantation, deceptively simple, used by Harry countless times, and one that should have rendered Horcruxes, Death Eaters, and perhaps even Voldemort himself powerless. It is, of course, the summoning charm. The Time Turner gave us the power to undo the past. Polyjuice let us become anyone we wanted. But if there's one spell that should have ended the series before it ever truly began, it's the summoning charm, Accio. A single word, a flick of the wand, and objects from across a room, or even across an entire castle, come flying into your hands. It's the kind of spell that feels innocent enough when Harry first learns it for the Triwizard Tournament, summoning his broom to fight the dragon. It's clever, it's heroic, and it makes for a thrilling scene. But once that door is opened, the question becomes obvious. Why not just summon everything? Horcruxes, the Marauder's map, Voldemort's wand, even Nagini herself. The problem with Accio isn't the spell itself, it's the way it's used so sparingly. Harry employs it a handful of times, usually in high-stakes moments, but it never becomes the everyday lifesaver it should logically be. Imagine how different the story would look if Harry had simply shouted, "Accio Locket," instead of spending chapters hunting through Gringotts or creeping into Umbridge's office. The spell should have been the ultimate shortcut, a magical grab-and-go solution to nearly every problem the characters faced. Yet Rowling keeps it boxed in, letting it appear just enough to solve one problem before conveniently disappearing, when it would solve too many others. Of course, fans have tried to patch the holes here too. Some argue that the spell only works on objects you can clearly visualize, which is why Harry could summon his broom, but not a Horcrux hidden in a vault. Others suggest powerful protective enchantments block it, making it useless against anything important. But those explanations feel thin when we see Accio working on items Harry barely has a connection to, or when we realize that so many of the obstacles in the series aren't protected by those kinds of barriers at all. Surely, at least one Horcrux could have been snatched with a quick summoning charm if Rowling had wanted it that way. And once again, this brings us back to the same problem as before. The rules of magic bend depending on what the story needs in the moment. When Harry is facing a dragon, Accio works flawlessly. When he's facing the impossible task of finding and destroying Horcruxes, suddenly the charm is forgotten. It's the same narrative inconsistency that plagued the Time Turner and the Polyjuice Potion. Magic is endlessly powerful until it risks ending the series too soon, and then it simply, Dusk's loophole takes that frustration and doubles it. Because it's not about a single spell or potion. It's about the way magic itself is policed, or rather, how poorly it is policed. The Trace, the supposed all-seeing system that monitors underage wizards, is meant to keep young witches and wizards in check. But, like so many other things in this universe, it only works when it wants to, and that inconsistency is our next stop. If the summoning charm makes us question the limits of what magic can do, the Trace makes us question the limits of how magic is controlled. Supposedly, this invisible monitoring system keeps underage witches and wizards from casting spells outside of school. The Ministry claims it can detect when and where magic is performed by minors, which sounds like a strong deterrent. In reality, though, it works more like a broken smoke alarm, sometimes blaring when there's no real problem, sometimes staying completely silent when the whole house is on fire. Take Chamber of Secrets. When Dobby levitates Aunt Patia's pudding, Harry is instantly blamed for underage magic, and the Ministry sends him a warning letter without hesitation. Yet, in Order of the Phoenix, when a Dementor attacks Harry in Little Whinging, and he has no choice but to use a Patronus, the Trace again singles him out, despite the fact that he's surrounded by a Muggle cousin and no one else casting spells. How exactly does the system know magic was used but not who cast it? If that's the case, why doesn't every wizarding household with children face this problem constantly? Wouldn't the Trace blame the kids every time their parents so much as lit a candle with their wands? It gets worse. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore visits Privet Drive and uses a litany of spells in Harry's living room, and the Ministry doesn't bat an eye. In Deathly Hallows, Harry turns 17 and the trace vanishes immediately, which suggests that the system is tied to age, not location. But if that's the case, why did the Ministry ever trust it as a reliable way to police underage magic? If a Muggle-born child is living in a house where all spells are attributed to them, then every protective charm their parents or mentors use could easily put the child at risk of punishment. The system is, at best, flawed, and at worst, utterly nonsensical. Fans, of course, have explanations. One common defense is that the trace only detects where magic occurs, not who does it, and that the Ministry simply assumes the underage witch or wizard in that household is to blame. That may make sense in theory, but it falls apart under scrutiny. If that's true, then Harry should never have been singled out in Chamber of Secrets, since his aunt, uncle, and cousin are all non-magical. There was no adult wizard to blame in that house, unless the Ministry really thought Uncle Vernon had been experimenting with levitation charms in the kitchen. Others argue that Dumbledore had ways of interfering with or masking the trace to protect Harry, but that feels more like fan speculation than anything Rowling herself put on the page. The bigger issue is that the trace is used as a convenient plot device. It's there when Rowling needs Harry to feel threatened by authority, and it's conveniently absent when she needs him to be free of suspicion. Like the Time Turner, like Polyjuice, like Accio, the trace operates not on consistent magical rules, but on narrative necessity. And once again, it chips away at the believability of the wizarding world. A government as paranoid and bureaucratic as the Ministry of Magic would surely create a better system than one that punishes kids arbitrarily and lets actual criminals slip through unnoticed. And if that inconsistency weren't enough, it brings us to another kind of magical protection that raises just as many questions, if not more. The Fidelius Charm, a spell so powerful it can hide a secret inside a single person's soul, yet so confusing in practice that it leaves us wondering whether Rowling ever fully understood her own invention. If the trace showed us the limits of how the Ministry monitors magic, the Fidelius Charm shows us the limits of how Rowling herself defined it. On paper, it's one of the most fascinating and powerful spells in the entire wizarding world. A secret hidden so deeply that it lives inside a single person's soul. Unless that person, the secret keeper, chooses to reveal it, no one can ever find what's being concealed. It's the spell that was supposed to keep the Potters safe from Voldemort, the very charm that James and Lily trusted with their lives. But the more closely you look at it, the more it unravels into a mess of contradictions. If the charm works the way it's described, then no one should have been able to find the Potters unless Peter Pettigrew himself told them. But in Prisoner of Azkaban, we learn that Voldemort discovered their location because Peter betrayed them. Fair enough. But then, in Order of the Phoenix, we see the spell used again at Grimmauld Place, where not just Harry, but dozens of members of the Order suddenly know about the headquarters. How is that possible, if only one person, in this case Dumbledore, is supposed to hold the secret? Did he reveal it to every single person individually? And if so, why does the house vanish from view entirely once he dies, as though the secret itself evaporated with him? The logic gets even hazier when you start thinking about mechanics. If someone already knows the secret, does the Fidelius stop working for them when the secret keeper dies? Does it shift automatically to someone else? Could multiple secret keepers exist at once if the first one shares it? And if that's the case, then wasn't the entire premise of hiding the Potters doomed from the start? If James and Lily had just chosen Dumbledore instead of Pettigrew, the story would have gone very differently. But then again, if Dumbledore could safely hold the secret for Grimmauld Place, why couldn't he have done the same for the Potters? Fans have tried to patch these cracks with theories. Some say that the spell was used differently at Grimmauld Place, that Dumbledore shared the secret widely on purpose, spreading it like a password. Others suggest that the magic of the charm weakens when the keeper dies, causing the hidden location to behave inconsistently. But the books never make these rules clear, leaving us with a spell that feels like it changes its function every time it's needed. Once again, what should be one of the most airtight protections in the wizarding world ends up being one of the leakiest. And yet, the Fidelius charm is only one example of how magical rules bend and blur when they clash with the story's needs. If hiding secrets can be this inconsistent, what about travel itself? The next loophole takes us from houses that shouldn't be found to schools that shouldn't be entered, and asks a simple question. If no one can apparate inside Hogwarts, then how come the house elves can? If the Fidelius charm leaves us scratching our heads about what can or cannot be hidden, the rules of apparition leave us equally baffled about where one can or cannot go. Time and again, we're told the same thing. No one can apparate inside Hogwarts. It's one of the school's most famous protections, repeated like a mantra throughout the series. Students can't simply vanish out of class, Death Eaters can't pop into the Great Hall, and Harry can't just skip the walk to the Astronomy Tower. On the surface, it makes perfect sense. Hogwarts is supposed to be impenetrable, a fortress of learning and safety. But then, just when we're convinced the rule is absolute, Rowling throws us a curveball in the form of the house elves. Because, here's the thing. House elves apparate freely in and out of Hogwarts, without the slightest bit of trouble. Dobby appears in the hospital wing. Kreacher vanishes from the kitchens. The elves treat the castle's protective enchantments as though they don't even exist. And that creates a gaping loophole in the narrative. If house elves can bypass protections that stump even the most powerful wizards, then why aren't they used more strategically in the war against Voldemort? Why doesn't Dumbledore recruit them as spies, slipping them in and out of enemy strongholds undetected? Why doesn't Harry ask Dobby to simply apparate into Gringotts, grab the cup Horcrux, and pop back out before anyone notices? Once again, the rules bend not around logic, but around narrative convenience. Some fans explain this by saying house elves use a different form of magic altogether, one older and deeper than wizarding spells, which is why they can ignore certain boundaries. That sounds intriguing, but it also raises bigger questions. If their magic is that powerful, then why are elves treated as second-class citizens? Why are they enslaved instead of revered as equals or even superiors? It would be like discovering the janitors at your office secretly have the ability to teleport through walls, but instead of promoting them, the company keeps them polishing doorknobs. The contradiction is too large to ignore, and Rowling herself seems to know it. When it suits the story, she leans into the uniqueness of house elf magic. But when it would create too many shortcuts, she conveniently pushes it into the background. We're told repeatedly that Hogwarts is unbreachable, yet we see small cracks appear over and over again. And the elves are just the most glaring example. For a castle that's meant to be the safest place in the wizarding world, it suddenly doesn't seem all that safe at all. And this brings us to an even bigger question about magic in Rowling's world. If Hogwarts can be so thoroughly protected, and if magic itself can be monitored and controlled by things like the Trace, why is it that wizards can't simply detect dangerous magic when it really matters? Why is it that Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard of his age, seems able to sense it at will while the Ministry of Magic is blind to it entirely? That inconsistency is the next loophole we need to explore. If apparition rules show us the cracks in Hogwarts defenses, then magic detection shows us the cracks in the wizarding world's very awareness. Over and over again, we see Dumbledore demonstrate an uncanny ability to sense the presence of dark magic. He can look at a ring and know it's cursed. He can examine a diary and suspect it holds more than ink. He can even deduce that Voldemort split his soul into multiple pieces, all through his sharp mind and his mysterious ability to feel the residue of spells. And yet, somehow, the rest of the magical world seems completely blind to these same signs. The Ministry of Magic, for all its resources, can't detect Horcruxes. Auras trained to hunt down dark wizards can't seem to spot cursed objects. And even the greatest magical banks, like Gringotts, apparently can't tell when one of their vaults is holding a fragment of a Dark Lord's soul. This inconsistency raises a glaring question. What are the actual limits of magical detection in Rowling's world? If Dumbledore can identify a Horcrux through observation and intuition, why can't the Ministry create spells or devices that replicate the process? Wizards are supposedly brilliant inventors. They've created charms that let you fly, maps that reveal every person in a castle, and potions that let you become someone else. And yet, when it comes to identifying the single most dangerous form of dark magic, they're helpless. It makes Voldemort's reign seem far easier than it should have been. After all, if no one can even sense what he's done, then the wizarding world isn't just vulnerable, it's willfully blind. Fans often defend this by saying Dumbledore is unique, that his brilliance and power set him apart. He's the greatest wizard of his age, the only one who could ever truly rival Voldemort. But that explanation feels unsatisfying, because it turns detection into a matter of personality instead of process. If only one man in an entire society can sense these dangers, then it suggests a massive flaw in the magical community as a whole. Surely, in a world obsessed with rules and order, someone would have codified Dumbledore's methods, written them down, and taught others to replicate them. But that never happens. Instead, the books rely on his mysterious instincts, as though he alone carries the weight of foresight. It keeps him elevated as a mentor figure for Harry, but it weakens the believability of the magical system. And this problem runs deeper than Horcruxes. Think about cursed objects in general. Katie Bell nearly dies from a cursed necklace in Half-Blood Prince, and yet no one, not even Madame Pomfrey, the school nurse who deals with magical injuries daily, can identify exactly what's wrong. The Weasleys run a joke shop with products that prank unsuspecting buyers, yet apparently no one regulates whether those objects are safe or dangerous. The wizarding world seems to operate without the kind of magical forensics that you'd expect in a society surrounded by spells. It's as if wizards can cast anything they want, but are completely clueless about the aftermath. Which leads us to the next, and perhaps most damning, inconsistency of all. If Dumbledore knew so much, if he could detect what others could not, then why did he keep so much information to himself? Why did he withhold knowledge about Horcruxes, about Voldemort, even about Harry's own fate, until it was almost too late? The issue of magic detection isn't just about what can or cannot be sensed. It's about what Dumbledore chose to say. And more importantly, what he chose to keep secret. If Dumbledore's ability to sense magic raises questions about what others couldn't detect, his choices about what to do with that knowledge raise even bigger ones. Again and again, we see that Dumbledore knew far more than he ever shared. He suspected that Diary in Chamber of Secrets was more than a simple cursed object. He pieced together the existence of Horcruxes long before anyone else dared to whisper the word. He even understood that Harry himself carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul. And yet, rather than share this information with the people who needed it most, Dumbledore kept it locked away until his death, forcing Harry to stumble through the final stages of the war half-blind. The central contradiction here is trust. Dumbledore trusted Harry to lead the fight against Voldemort, but not enough to arm him with the full truth. He placed an enormous burden on a teenager's shoulders, yet withheld the tools that could have made that burden easier to carry. If Harry had known about the Horcruxes sooner, perhaps he could have started hunting them earlier, saving lives along the way. If Harry had been told the full story of his connection to Voldemort, he might have approached his final sacrifice with understanding instead of confusion. Instead, Dumbledore's secrecy left Harry to figure it out in the heat of battle, guided only by cryptic clues and second-hand guesses. Fans often argue that Dumbledore kept quiet because knowledge of Horcruxes was too dangerous. That if Harry had known too soon, Voldemort might have sensed it through their psychic connection. Others claim Dumbledore wanted Harry to grow, to learn resilience by discovering the truth himself. But these explanations ring hollow when you realize the cost of his silence. Cedric dies in the graveyard. Sirius falls at the Department of Mysteries. Dobby is killed at Malfoy Manor, and countless others perish at Hogwarts, all while Dumbledore sits on information that might have changed the outcome. In his effort to protect Harry from too much knowledge, he exposed him, and everyone around him, to far more danger. It's one of the great paradoxes of the series. The man who dedicated his life to defeating Voldemort may have prolonged the Dark Lord's reign through his own secrecy. His genius gave him insight, but his pride convinced him that only he could decide when others were ready to hear the truth. That pride costs dearly, and perhaps no moment illustrates the consequences of holding back better than the tragic death of Sirius Black. Because, in that case, it wasn't Voldemort's curse or Dumbledore's silence that doomed him, but Harry's failure to use something he already had, a two-way mirror that could have changed everything. If Dumbledore's secrecy shows us the danger of what isn't said, then the death of Sirius Black shows us the danger of what isn't used. Of all the losses Harry suffers, Sirius's death in the Department of Mysteries feels both heartbreaking and avoidable, and not just because of the fight itself. Before his godfather falls through the veil, Sirius had already given Harry a lifeline. A simple square of glass that could have bridged the distance between them at any time. The two-way mirror, it was a gift that should have changed everything. With the mirror, Harry could have spoken to Sirius whenever he wanted. He could have confirmed whether the vision Voldemort planted in his mind was real or not. He could have avoided rushing headlong into a trap, dragging his friends into mortal danger. But instead, the mirror sits forgotten at the bottom of Harry's trunk, gathering dust until it reappears conveniently in Deathly Hallows, too late to save Sirius, and used instead to summon the mysterious figure of Aberforth Dumbledore. And that's where the loophole stings the most. Rowling introduces an object with enormous potential, then allows her characters to ignore it until tragedy strikes. It feels less like a natural oversight and more like a deliberate narrative trick, as though the mirror had to be forgotten, because remembering it would ruin the plot. After all, if Harry had used it, the entire climax of Order of the Phoenix might never have happened. Voldemort's trap would have failed, the battle at the Ministry might not have unfolded, and Sirius might have lived. By neglecting the mirror, Rowling ensures the story moves forward, but at the cost of logic. Fans sometimes argue that Harry was a teenager, impulsive and emotional, and of course he would forget about a small gift at the bottom of his school trunk. But this defense feels thin, especially when we consider how desperately Harry longed to talk to Sirius throughout that entire book. He risked Umbridge's wrath, just to communicate with him through the Floo network. And yet never once thought to use the mirror designed exactly for that purpose. It isn't believable, and it makes Sirius's death feel less like the result of fate and more like the result of forced forgetfulness. The irony, of course, is that the mirror becomes important later, just not in time to save the man who gave it. It's a loophole that hurts because it isn't abstract like the Fidelia's charm or the trace. It's painfully concrete. A boy ignored the one tool that could have saved the person he loved most, and the story never stops to reconcile that fact. It's not just a missed opportunity for Harry. It's a missed opportunity for the entire series. And in that way, Sirius's forgotten mirror ties into a broader theme of objects appearing and disappearing when the plot demands it. Sometimes they're forgotten until it's convenient. Other times they appear in the hands of whoever most needs them. And nowhere is this clearer than in the case of one legendary object, forged for Gryffindor himself, that conveniently turns up only when Rowling wants it to. The Sword of Gryffindor. If Sirius's mirror shows us the danger of an object forgotten, the Sword of Gryffindor shows us the danger of an object that remembers too much. Unlike the mirror, which lay useless at the bottom of Harry's trunk, the sword has a strange way of showing up exactly when the story needs it. First hidden in the Sorting Hat, then suddenly appearing to Harry in the Chamber of Secrets. Later finding its way to the bottom of an icy forest pool. And finally sliding into Neville's hands in the climactic battle at Hogwarts. It is, in every sense, a narrative boomerang, thrown away into obscurity until the exact moment it's required, at which point it comes flying back with impeccable timing. Now, the official explanation is that the sword appears to any worthy Gryffindor in a moment of need. That's why it appeared for Harry when he faced the basilisk, and later for Neville when he stood up to Voldemort. But this so-called rule opens up more questions than it answers. If the sword is so eager to help Gryffindors, why didn't it appear earlier in Deathly Hallows? When Harry and Hermione were stumbling through the woods, desperate for a Horcrux killer, why did they have to endure Ron's dramatic return scene before the sword decided to reveal itself? And why, if it could pop into Neville's hand during the final duel, didn't it appear for other Gryffindors who had proven their courage many times before? Was Fred not worthy as he fought and died in the castle? Was Ginny not worthy, risking her life repeatedly against the Carrows? The truth is that the sword operates less like a magical artifact bound by clear rules and more like a writer's tool for dramatic convenience. It shows up where Rowling needs it most, wrapped in an aura of destiny that excuses its selective appearances. But in practice, this makes the logic of the sword collapse under scrutiny. If it is truly attuned to bravery and need, then it should have been flying out of the Sorting Hat and into Gryffindor hands constantly during the Battle of Hogwarts, where hundreds of students and alumni displayed courage beyond measure. Instead, it chooses Neville at the perfect moment to deliver a cinematic finale, a choice that feels less like magic and more like choreography. Fans defend the sword by pointing out its unique connection to Godric Gryffindor and its supposed enchantments. They argue that it recognizes not just bravery, but purity of intent, appearing only when someone's courage is tied to a righteous cause. But again, the books never make this explicit. It becomes another example of rules that shift as needed, vague enough to excuse anything while never offering consistency. In the end, the sword feels less like a legendary relic of Gryffindor's legacy and more like a stage prop, waiting in the wings until it's time to make a dramatic entrance. And this brings us to yet another legendary object, one treated with far less reverence for most of the series. Unlike the sword, which is framed as a weapon of destiny, This object spends much of the story masquerading as nothing more than a schoolboy's toy. Only in the final book do we discover its true significance, and by then it feels almost too late. I'm talking, of course, about the invisibility cloak, a deathly hallow in disguise. If the Sword of Gryffindor is guilty of showing up too conveniently, the invisibility cloak is guilty of the opposite, of being treated as an ordinary toy until suddenly being revealed as one of the most powerful magical artifacts in existence. For most of the series, the cloak is a clever tool, something Harry uses to sneak into the restricted section or slip past Filch. It's a student's prank item, albeit a very useful one, and even Dumbledore treats it as a curiosity rather than a treasure. But then, in Deathly Hallows, we learn the truth. This isn't just any cloak. It's the cloak, one of the Deathly Hallows, crafted to make its wearer completely invisible, even to death itself. In other words, one of the most sacred and powerful objects in wizarding history was hiding in Harry's trunk, used mostly for sneaking into the kitchens. This revelation creates a serious problem of scale. If the cloak is truly indestructible, capable of perfect concealment that no spell can undo, then its casual use throughout the earlier books becomes absurd. Why did no one notice its uniqueness? Dumbledore, who seemed to know everything, should have realized from the start what Harry had been given. Instead, he plays coy, pretending it's just another magical heirloom until the story demands its importance. And once the cloak is revealed as a hallow, its prior appearances feel strangely diminished, as though all those adventures under it should have carried far more weight than they did. Even more puzzling is how underused the cloak becomes once its true power is revealed. If it is truly the ultimate defense, then why doesn't Harry wear it constantly during the Battle of Hogwarts? Why doesn't he slip under it while searching for Horcruxes, avoiding confrontation entirely until the final blow can be struck? For that matter, why didn't James and Lily use it the night Voldemort came? An artifact that can literally hide someone from death itself is treated, for 6 entire books, as little more than a schoolboy's get-out-of-detention card. It's a loophole so large it swallows much of the supposed danger Harry faces. Fans often excuse this by pointing out that Harry is, after all, a teenager. He might not grasp the full significance of what he has. But this ignores the adults around him. Dumbledore, McGonagall, even Mad-Eye Moody, who should have recognized the cloak's nature. If the story expects us to believe that the Hallows are legendary, whispered about for centuries, then the appearance of one in plain sight should have caused a sensation. Instead, it barely raises an eyebrow until it becomes narratively convenient to connect the dots. And so, like the Sword of Gryffindor, the invisibility cloak bends under the weight of its own contradictions. Sometimes it's ordinary, sometimes it's extraordinary, but it's never consistent. And perhaps no character embodies this same inconsistency more than Voldemort himself. A wizard so obsessed with conquering death that he ignores the one kind of magic that could have defeated him from the very beginning. The magic of love. If the invisibility cloak shows us how a legendary object can be taken for granted, Voldemort's downfall shows us how a legendary lesson can be ignored. From the very beginning, we are told that Harry survived the killing curse because of his mother's sacrifice, an ancient, primal kind of protection born not from spells or strategy, but from love. This is the core of the series. The great secret that Voldemort never understands, that love itself can be stronger than death. Yet, for all his brilliance, Voldemort never adapts. He learns about this flaw in his logic during his first defeat. He sees it again when Harry escapes him in the graveyard, and Dumbledore even spells it out clearly for us. Voldemort cannot comprehend love, and yet, rather than adjust his methods, Rather than experiment with ways to circumvent this protective power, he charges forward again and again, using the same killing curses that failed him the first time. This raises a glaring loophole in Voldemort's supposed genius. If he truly was the most powerful dark wizard of his age, feared across the world for his cunning and ruthlessness, then why didn't he ever consider alternatives? Why not test different forms of magic on Harry? Why not imprison him, torture him, or attempt to break him through psychological manipulation rather than brute force? Voldemort's obsession with the killing curse is treated as a mark of arrogance, but it also exposes a shocking lack of creativity. For a man who invented spells, split his soul into pieces, and evaded death for decades, he suddenly becomes remarkably unimaginative when it comes to dealing with a boy who's been protected by love since infancy. Some fans defend this by saying Voldemort's very inability to understand love is his fatal flaw, that the story requires him to repeat his mistake, so that Harry can ultimately triumph. And narratively, that works. It's poetic, almost mythic, but logically, it feels flimsy. Even if Voldemort didn't grasp the power of love, he witnessed it enough times to know that something beyond ordinary magic was shielding Harry. A man as paranoid and controlling as Voldemort would not simply shrug and say, "Well, better try Avada Kedavra again." He would seek answers, experiment, and find ways around it. His refusal to do so doesn't feel like strategy. It feels like plot necessity. And the irony here is sharp. Voldemort is destroyed not by the brilliance of his enemies, but by his own refusal to learn. The man who split his soul to avoid death is undone, because he could not open his mind to the one kind of magic that required no study, no books, no rituals. The arrogance of dismissing love is supposed to be his undoing. But it also makes him look less like a terrifying mastermind, and more like a villain stuck in a loop, repeating the same mistake until it kills him. And yet, Voldemort is not the only one guilty of clinging to contradictions. The Ministry of Magic has its own blind spots, particularly when it comes to enforcing its rules. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the case of Hagrid's wand, a wand that was supposedly snapped in two when he was expelled, and yet somehow continues to cast spells from the tip of a pink umbrella. If Voldemort's downfall shows us the consequences of ignoring the rules of love, Hagrid's wand shows us the consequences of ignoring the rules of logic. When Hagrid is expelled from Hogwarts for supposedly opening the Chamber of Secrets, the Ministry decrees that his wand be snapped in two. The punishment is absolute. Without a wand, Hagrid should never again be able to practice magic. And yet, from the very moment we meet him in Philosopher's Stone, Hagrid is carrying an umbrella that just so happens to shoot fire, light fires, and bend rules in ways no ordinary umbrella could. It doesn't take a magical genius to put two and two together. His wand was never destroyed. It was simply hidden in plain sight, wrapped in pink fabric, and held by a man who can barely keep a secret. The problem is that this raises enormous questions about the Ministry's competence. If they really wanted to strip Hagrid of his magical ability, why didn't they check that the wand was actually destroyed? Why didn't they monitor him afterwards to ensure he wasn't still practicing? Surely the Ministry, with all its bureaucracy and paranoia, would have followed through more thoroughly. Instead, they leave Hagrid with half punishment, a sentence that is more symbolic than real. The man is still using magic openly, albeit clumsily, and no one seems to care. Not even Dumbledore, who clearly knows what's inside that umbrella, bothers to intervene or correct the record. Fans often try to justify this by suggesting Dumbledore smuggled the broken pieces of Hagrid's wand back to him and allowed him to keep them as a gesture of trust. And while that may explain the umbrella's existence, it doesn't solve the bigger issue. If the Ministry can be fooled this easily, then what does that say about every other law they enforce? Are there hundreds of expelled students secretly carrying broken wands in teapots, walking sticks, and coat hangers? If destroying a wand is supposed to prevent dangerous wizards from regaining power, then Hagrid's pink umbrella proves that the system doesn't work at all. The loophole becomes even more glaring when you realize how much leeway Hagrid actually has. He's allowed to serve as keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts, living in close proximity to hundreds of children. Despite his dangerous status, he escorts Harry into Diagon Alley and even performs magic in front of him, sending Dudley Dursley flying across the room with a pig's tail, all without consequence. If the Ministry had truly banned him from magic, wouldn't this be a violation worth pursuing? Instead, it's brushed off as comic relief, leaving us with the impression that wizarding laws are not laws at all, but guidelines to be ignored when convenient. And this pattern of forgetting or underusing powerful magical tools isn't unique to Hagrid. Even within the trio itself, opportunities are missed constantly. Take Ron, for example, who inherits one of the most unusual magical items in the series, a Deluminator that can guide him back to his friends no matter where he is. A tool so remarkable it could have saved him countless times. And yet, much like Sirius's mirror, it's barely used at all. If Hagrid's umbrella shows us how magical objects can slip through the cracks of authority, Ron's Deluminator shows us how magical objects can slip through the cracks of memory. The Deluminator is no ordinary trinket, given to Ron by Dumbledore in his will. It's one of the most peculiar and fascinating devices in the series. At first, it seems simple enough. A lighter that can snuff out and capture light, plunging a room into darkness with a click. But in Deathly Hallows, it reveals its true power. When Ron abandons Harry and Hermione in a moment of anger, the Deluminator not only helps him find his way back, but actually guides him through space itself, pulling him toward the sound of Hermione's voice. It's as though the object was designed not just to manipulate light, but to reconnect the people who needed each other most. And yet, despite its enormous potential, Ron barely uses it. Once it serves its narrative purpose of reuniting him with Harry and Hermione, the Deluminator fades into the background, tucked away in his pocket, as though it were just a sentimental keepsake. But think about what it could have done if used more creatively. In a world where friends are constantly split up, captured, or lost, an object that literally calls you back to those you love is priceless. Why didn't Ron activate it during the Battle of Hogwarts to track down his family? Why didn't he use it to find Harry in moments of chaos when danger separated them? Even during the hunt for Horcruxes, when communication and trust were at their lowest, the Deluminator could have been a tool to strengthen their bond. Instead, it sits dormant, its full potential never explored. Some readers defend this by saying Dumbledore intended it specifically for Ron, as a way to ensure he would always find his way back to his friends. And while that sentiment is touching, it doesn't explain why Ron himself didn't take advantage of it more often. The boy who often feels left out, overshadowed, or insecure could have found comfort in the one object designed to remind him he belonged. But instead, Ron treats the Deluminator as a one-time lifeline rather than a constant companion. It feels less like a magical object with consistent rules and more like a plot device deployed at exactly the right moment to create drama and reconciliation. The result is another loophole in the wizarding world's logic. Why introduce such an extraordinary tool if it's going to be used only once? The Deluminator is a symbol of Ron's place in the trio, yes, but it's also a reminder of how often Rowling introduces magical items with game-changing potential, only to ignore them once they've served their immediate purpose. The mirror, the sword, the cloak, the time turner, all follow the same pattern. And perhaps the most striking example of this comes not in the hands of the trio at all, but in the form of a map so powerful it reveals every person in Hogwarts, and yet somehow fails to expose one of the darkest secrets hiding right under their noses. If the Deluminator shows us an object that's barely used, the Marauder's map shows us one that should have been used too much. Of all the magical tools in the series, this one may be the most outrageous in its implications. A single sheet of parchment that reveals every room, every passage, and every person in Hogwarts at any given moment. It doesn't just show names, it shows movements, footsteps, and even disguises. Polyjuice Potion, worthless, invisibility cloak, useless, animagus transformations. Pointless, nothing escapes the Marauder's map. And yet, despite its extraordinary power, the map somehow fails to expose one of the greatest secrets of the entire series. Peter Pettigrew, think about it. Fred and George Weasley had this map for years before giving it to Harry. They used it to sneak into kitchens, dodge teachers, and explore secret passageways. They saw every name walking through those corridors, and they knew every student by sight. Are we really supposed to believe they never once noticed a strange man named Peter Pettigrew sleeping in their younger brother's bed night after night? Pettigrew lived as Scabbers the Rat for over a decade, often right under their noses, and the map should have revealed him the entire time. And yet, no one, not the twins, not Ron, not Harry, ever questions the presence of a fully grown man wandering the Gryffindor dormitory, labeled clearly on the page. This oversight isn't just an oddity, it's a gaping hole. The map is used selectively, appearing when it can advance the plot and disappearing when it would spoil the surprise. It shows Harry the location of Snape and Lupin when he needs to know, but conveniently fails to make Pettigrew's betrayal obvious until the exact moment Rowling wants it revealed. The map, like so many other magical tools, doesn't obey a consistent set of rules. It obeys the narrative. Fans have tried to explain this away. Some suggest Fred and George weren't paying close attention to every name, that they only used the map to avoid trouble rather than study the details. Others argue that perhaps Pettigrew disguised his name magically, though nothing in the books supports this. The simplest explanation is the one no fan really wants to admit. Rowling needed Pettigrew's secret to stay hidden, so the map had to fail. The problem is that the Marauder's map is too powerful to be treated so casually. If Harry had studied it closely, he could have uncovered the truth of Pettigrew years earlier. He might have saved Sirius from years on the run. He might have changed the entire trajectory of the story. Instead, the map joins the growing list of magical objects that appear when convenient and vanish when they threaten to disrupt the plot. And this brings us to yet another magical object with rules that bend and blur depending on the story's needs. The Marauder's map may raise questions about who it reveals, but the Elder Wand raises an even bigger question about who it obeys. By now, we've walked through 15 loopholes in the wizarding world, and what's striking is not just the individual inconsistencies, but the pattern they reveal when we line them up side by side. Each magical object, spell, or system that Rowling introduces begins with immense promise. But almost every single one ends up undermined by contradictions, half-explanations, or sheer narrative convenience. Take the Time Turner. Introduced as a clever trick to help Hermione take extra classes, it instantly raises the question of why it wasn't used to save lives or stop Voldemort altogether. The Polyjuice Potion followed, showing us how transformations sometimes change voices and sometimes don't, depending on what the plot requires. Then came Accio, the summoning charm, which should have been a shortcut to every Horcrux, but instead faded into the background once its usefulness threatened the story's tension. The trace was supposed to enforce magical law, but in practice, it only caught Harry when Rowling wanted him in trouble and ignored countless other situations. The Fidelius charm, meant to be the ultimate protection, collapsed under its own confusing rules about how secrets are shared. And Apparition, supposedly blocked at Hogwarts, turned out to be no barrier for house elves, creating another hole in the castle's supposedly impenetrable defenses. From there, the pattern deepened. Dumbledore could detect dark magic when no one else could, but instead of sharing what he knew, he hoarded secrets, forcing Harry to stumble through danger in ignorance. Sirius gave Harry a mirror that could have saved him, but Harry conveniently forgot about it until it was too late. The Sword of Gryffindor appeared only when dramatically useful. The invisibility cloak masqueraded as a toy before being revealed as a legendary Hallow, and Voldemort himself ignored the very magic that defeated him in the first place. Love. And then we came to Hagrid, whose supposedly broken wand continued to work just fine in a pink umbrella, exposing the Ministry's incompetence. Ron, meanwhile, was given the Deluminator, a device that could guide him to his friends from anywhere in the world, and used it once before letting it fade into obscurity. And finally, the Marauders map, which should have revealed Peter Pettigrew years earlier, became another object that worked only when it wouldn't ruin the surprise. What ties all these loopholes together is a fundamental problem. The rules of Rowling's world are not rules at all, but narrative conveniences. Magic is endlessly powerful, but only until it threatens to make the story too easy. Laws exist, but only until enforcing them would complicate the plot. Objects are introduced with dazzling potential, then ignored or forgotten once they've served their purpose. It's a pattern we'll continue to see as we move forward, because the next stretch of loopholes will take us deeper into the contradictions of the wizarding world. Objects of destiny that choose their owners, spells that rewrite the rules of loyalty, and protections that work right up until the moment they don't. So far, we've seen how the wizarding world struggles with time, identity, detection, and trust. Next, we turn our attention to power itself, and how the Elder Wand, supposedly the most unbeatable weapon in history, can't even follow its own rules. If the Marauders map showed us how objects can see everything and still reveal nothing, the Elder Wand shows us how objects can do anything and still make no sense. Touted as the most powerful wand in existence, a Deathly Hallow forged by Death himself, the Elder Wand is supposed to answer only to its true master. The problem, of course, is figuring out exactly what that means, because the books never settle on a single set of rules. At one moment, mastery is transferred by killing the previous owner. At another, it's transferred simply by disarming them. At yet another, the wand seems to shift its allegiance based on intent or circumstance. By the time we reach the climax of Deathly Hallows, the rules of loyalty have become so tangled that Harry wins not through spellwork, but through technicalities. Consider the logic that gets us there. Voldemort believes killing Snape will give him control of the wand, because Snape killed Dumbledore, but, in reality, Draco Malfoy disarmed Dumbledore at the Astronomy Tower, which means Draco, not Snape, became the true master. And when Harry later disarms Draco, the wand supposedly transfers its loyalty to him. By the end of this chain of events, the fate of the wizarding world rests not on courage or skill, but on the fact that Harry once snatched a wand from Draco's hand in Malfoy Manor. It's a victory of paperwork, not power. The inconsistency here isn't just confusing, it undermines the entire mystique of the Elder Wand. If it can be won by disarming rather than killing, then why did it have such a bloody reputation to begin with? Why did generations of wizards fear it if all that was required to take it was a well-timed Expelliarmus? The wand that was supposed to be unbeatable turns out to be governed by rules so vague they collapse under scrutiny. And worse, the final showdown, one of the most anticipated moments in modern literature, hinges less on Harry's strength or Voldemort's weakness, and more on a series of technical loopholes in wand ownership. Fans often defend this by arguing that the Elder Wand was never about brute force, but about understanding its nature. Harry wins because he knows the wand's true history, while Voldemort falls because he misunderstands it. And that explanation works narratively. It ties into the theme of knowledge as power. But it still doesn't erase the contradictions. If wand loyalty is so fragile that it shifts with a simple disarm, then every duel in wizarding history should have been a potential game of musical chairs, with wands changing allegiance constantly. Yet we're told that this is unique to the Elder Wand, which raises even more questions about why it plays by different rules than every other wand in existence. And much like the Sword of Gryffindor, the Elder Wand becomes a prop for destiny rather than a consistent magical tool. It serves its purpose in delivering the final blow, but once again, the rules don't add up. Which brings us to another object tied closely to Voldemort's downfall, one that's equally plagued by contradictions. Because, if the Elder Wand's ownership is confusing, then Nagini's role as a Horcrux is downright baffling. If the Elder Wand leaves us puzzled over loyalty, Nagini leaves us puzzled over logic. By the time we reach Deathly Hallows, it's made clear that Voldemort has tethered part of his soul to his beloved Snake. She isn't just his companion, she's a Horcrux, a living container for immortality. But this revelation raises a storm of contradictions. If Dumbledore suspected Nagini was a Horcrux as early as Half-Blood Prince, then why didn't anyone act sooner? Why didn't the Order of the Phoenix make destroying her a top priority before the final battle, rather than waiting until Neville conveniently swings the Sword of Gryffindor at the climax? The problem with Nagini as a Horcrux is that she defies the very rules that govern Horcruxes in the first place. Every other Horcrux is hidden away in a secure location, the diary locked in a vault, the locket buried at the bottom of a cave, the diadem stashed in the Room of Requirement. But Nagini slithers into battle at Voldemort's side, exposed to danger, vulnerable in a way no other Horcrux ever is. It's a baffling strategy for a man who supposedly values his soul above all else. Why would Voldemort entrust his immortality to a creature that can be killed with a single well-aimed sword, spell, or fang? Fans have suggested that Voldemort grew so arrogant by the end of his reign that he no longer cared about protecting Nagini. Others point out that he may have needed her close, not only as a weapon, but as a kind of anchor for his fractured soul. But even if we accept those explanations, it still leaves us with the same issue. If Nagini was truly that important, then Dumbledore and the Order should have focused all their energy on eliminating her as soon as they suspected the truth. Instead, the task is left hanging until Neville, in a moment of cinematic symmetry, cuts her down. It's heroic, it's dramatic, but it doesn't make sense when weighed against everything at stake. And beyond strategy, Nagini's status as a living Horcrux opens another loophole in the magical rules. Horcruxes are supposed to be objects, vessels designed to contain fragments of a soul. How does this work with a living being? Does Nagini have her own soul, or is she completely overridden by Voldemort's? If the destruction of a Horcrux is supposed to release part of Voldemort's soul into oblivion, what happens to Nagini's own essence in the process? The books never explore these questions, and the result is a magical system that feels vague and inconsistent. In the end, Nagini as a Horcrux feels less like a carefully planned detail and more like a narrative convenience. Rowling needed a dramatic moment for Neville, a symbol of his growth and bravery, and Nagini provided the perfect target. But in giving that moment to Neville, the rules of Horcruxes are bent. The logic of Voldemort's strategy is broken, and the story asks us to ignore all the contradictions for the sake of a satisfying scene. And speaking of Horcruxes, Nagini's case leads us straight into another problem. One that isn't about which objects Voldemort chose, but about how exactly those objects could be destroyed. Because if you think the rules of ownership are confusing, the rules of destruction are even worse. If Nagini's role as a Horcrux left us confused about what can hold a soul, the rules for destroying Horcruxes leave us even more confused about what can unmake one. From the very beginning, we're told that Horcruxes are almost impossible to destroy. That's why Voldemort scattered them across the wizarding world, trusting that they would keep him tethered to life indefinitely. And yet, once the hunt begins in Deathly Hallows, the rules for destroying them shift and slide depending on the moment. Basilisk venom destroys Tom Riddle's diary. The Sword of Gryffindor works because it has absorbed basilisk venom. Fundfire consumes the diadem. But then other Horcruxes, like the locket, the cup, and the ring, are destroyed with what feels like far less ceremony. The supposed near impossibility of Horcrux destruction turns out to be a surprisingly flexible concept. The biggest contradiction lies in the availability of basilisk venom. In Chamber of Secrets, Harry stabs the diary with a fang, establishing the venom as lethal to Horcruxes. Later, Dumbledore even explains that the venom's corrosive power is one of the few substances capable of destroying them. But after that moment, no one seems to make use of it. Harry doesn't collect any fangs from the basilisk corpse, even though they would have been invaluable. It isn't until years later, when Ron and Hermione revisit the chamber, that they finally take advantage of the supply. In a story where defeating Horcruxes is the ultimate goal, the lack of urgency in gathering the one known weapon against them feels less like logic and more like oversight. Fundfire raises another problem. The cursed fire that Crabbe accidentally unleashes in the Room of Requirement is presented as wildly destructive, powerful enough to annihilate Horcruxes. But if Fundfire is truly so effective, why isn't it part of the plan? Why don't the Order of the Phoenix, or even Dumbledore himself, master it for the explicit purpose of destroying Horcruxes? Instead, it's introduced suddenly, used once, and then never mentioned again. Another case of magical rules bent to serve a single dramatic moment. The lack of consistency in Horcrux destruction also weakens Voldemort's supposed genius. If the objects meant to guarantee his immortality can be undone by relatively accessible means, venom from a beast, a cursed fire, or even just a particularly sharp sword, then his strategy begins to look reckless. For a man who feared death above all else, he placed his fate in vessels that, once discovered, could be dismantled with tools already available to the very students he underestimated. In the end, the Horcruxes highlight the same problem we've seen with so many other magical objects. Their rules are vague until they need to be precise, and then they are precise only for as long as the scene demands. The result is that what should have been the most terrifying safeguard in the wizarding world ends up feeling less like a fortress and more like a series of paper walls, crumbling the moment someone thinks to poke at them. And this inconsistency bleeds directly into the next major loophole. Not about Horcruxes themselves, but about the competition that put Harry in Voldemort's path in the first place. Because if Horcruxes were difficult to destroy, The Triwizard Tournament was supposed to be even more dangerous to survive. And yet, the rules of that competition collapse the moment Harry's name comes out of the Goblet of Fire. If Horcrux Destruction showed us how rules can be bent until they break, the Triwizard Tournament shows us how rules can be ignored entirely. The competition is billed as one of the most dangerous and prestigious events in the wizarding world, bound by ancient magic and overseen by multiple ministries. The Goblet of Fire itself is supposed to be infallible. Once it selects a champion, that selection is binding, a magical contract that cannot be broken. But the moment Harry's name comes out of the cup, the entire foundation of the tournament collapses under scrutiny. For starters, if the goblet is so powerful that its choices must be honored, then why wasn't the tournament simply cancelled? When it became obvious that the system had been tampered with, Dumbledore, McGonagall, and even Barty Crouch Sr. acknowledged the danger. Yet, instead of protecting a 14-year-old boy from almost certain death, they shrugged their shoulders and say, "Rules are rules." This would be laughable if it weren't treated with such gravity in the story. Surely, if a magical contract can be broken by simply refusing to participate, then the safety of the competitors would come first. Instead, the adults stand by and allow Harry to risk his life in a rigged contest, because the plot requires him to be there. Even the tasks themselves reveal the arbitrariness of the tournament's rules. Champions are told not to use outside help, yet Harry receives hints from Hagrid, Moody, and even Cedric. Champions are expected to show independence. Yet Fleur is knocked out of the competition without much ceremony, leaving the final task effectively a duel between Harry and Cedric. And of course, the most glaring loophole of all is the Triwizard Cup itself, which is turned into a portkey by Barty Crouch Jr. with shocking ease. If this was supposed to be a competition under the highest level of supervision, how does one rogue Death Eater alter the centerpiece of the final task without anyone noticing? Fans argue that the Goblet of Fire bound Harry to compete because magical contracts are absolute. But this explanation only pushes the problem back a step. If magical contracts are so binding, why doesn't the wizarding world use them for more important things? Why not bind Death Eaters from rejoining Voldemort? Why not bind politicians to their promises? The selective use of magical contracts makes the entire concept feel flimsy, and the justification that Harry had no choice feels less like law and more like plot device. The Triwizard Tournament is presented as a grand tradition, a test of courage and skill. But in practice, it becomes another stage for loopholes. Harry isn't meant to compete, yet he does. The rules aren't meant to be broken, yet they are. And in the end, the entire spectacle exists for one purpose: to deliver Harry to Voldemort in the graveyard. The problem is that the logic holding it together doesn't survive even the first spark of scrutiny. And if the Goblet of Fire itself raises questions, then the portkey it creates raises even more. Because if the Ministry is capable of controlling and regulating portkeys, how is it that the deadliest of all dark wizards manipulates one of them right under their noses? At this point in our journey, we've explored another set of loopholes, each one tied not just to magic, but to the question of power. Who has it, who controls it, and how its rules bend the moment they're tested. We began with the Elder Wand, the so-called unbeatable weapon, whose legendary power collapses into a technicality about who disarmed whom. What should have been the ultimate duel in wizarding history ended not with a triumph of skill, but with paperwork-level logic, leaving the greatest magical artifact in history feeling strangely hollow. Then we turned to Nagini, the living Horcrux, a contradiction in every sense. Voldemort places his soul in a creature he parades into battle, vulnerable to the simplest sword, undermining his own obsession with immortality. It's a choice that makes for powerful symbolism in Neville's final strike, but terrible strategy for a man who feared death above all else. From there, we tackled the destruction of Horcruxes themselves, supposedly near impossible to destroy, yet undone by a fang, a sword, or a bit of cursed fire. What should have been a nearly insurmountable challenge became a patchwork of convenient solutions, each one appearing only when the plot demanded. Finally, we arrived at the Triwizard Tournament, a grand tradition that collapsed the moment Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire. A magical contract, too binding to break, rules too sacred to bend. Until, of course, they were bent for the sake of sending Harry to Voldemort. Once again, the supposed order and consistency of the wizarding world gave way to narrative convenience, and, together, these four loopholes reveal a deeper truth about Rowling's universe. Power is never about rules. It's about drama. Objects that should obey strict laws instead twist themselves into whatever shape the story needs. The result is less a coherent magical system and more a stage play, where props change their meaning from one act to the next. And nowhere is this clearer than with Portkeys, magical objects that can transport wizards anywhere, supposedly controlled and regulated by the Ministry. If that's the case, how was Voldemort able to turn the Triwizard Cup into one, right under the noses of the world's most powerful witches and wizards? If the Triwizard Tournament showed us how rules can be ignored, Portkeys show us how they can be bypassed entirely. By the time Harry and Cedric grasp the Triwizard Cup, we're told it's been turned into a Portkey, an everyday object enchanted to transport whoever touches it to another location. On paper, Portkeys are supposed to be tightly regulated by the Ministry of Magic. We even see this earlier in Goblet of Fire, when the Weasleys, Harry, and Hermione travel to the Quidditch World Cup. Mr. Weasley explains that Portkeys are created under strict control, with designated objects, times, and locations to prevent chaos. They are, in other words, not toys to be tampered with lightly. And yet, in the most heavily monitored event of the year, an object central to the tournament, the very prize the champions are competing for, is turned into a Portkey by Barty Crouch Jr., a Death Eater in disguise. The question almost asks itself, how? How could the Ministry, with its supposed layers of oversight, fail to notice that the Final Tasks trophy had been enchanted to whisk two students directly into Voldemort's arms? If Portkeys are so carefully supervised, how could the deadliest one in wizarding history have slipped through the cracks? The implications are staggering. Either the Ministry is so incompetent that they didn't bother to inspect the cup, or Portkeys are far easier to make than we've been led to believe. And if the latter is true, then the wizarding world is sitting on a loophole that could destabilize society. Imagine if any witch or wizard could turn a chair, a shoe, or a coin into a Portkey with no oversight. Kidnapping, smuggling, and sabotage would be endless. Yet, for most of the series, Portkeys appear as tightly monitored, rare occurrences, until, of course, Voldemort needs one to lure Harry into the graveyard. Fans sometimes argue that Crouch Jr. was able to alter the cup because of his position under Polyjuice, disguised as Moody, with access to Hogwarts and the trust of Dumbledore. And while that may explain proximity, it doesn't explain regulation. The cup wasn't a trinket sitting in a teacher's office. It was the centerpiece of an international competition in front of multiple ministries and schools. To believe that not one of them thought to check the magical integrity of the trophy strains the limits of credibility. The truth is that the Portkey loophole serves one purpose: to deliver Harry into Voldemort's hands. Without it, the graveyard scene doesn't happen, Cedric doesn't die, and the Dark Lord doesn't return to full strength. But in achieving this narrative goal, the story breaks its own rules about magical regulation and enforcement. What was once presented as a tightly controlled form of transportation becomes, in a moment of plot necessity, an overlooked backdoor into the most secure event in the wizarding world. And this inconsistency leads us directly into the next loophole, one that concerns not magical travel, but magical communication. Because if the Ministry can supposedly regulate something as volatile as chaos, why can't the Order of the Phoenix find a reliable way to communicate without relying on vague signals, intercepted owls, and risky meetings? If portkeys reveal the flaws in magical transportation, the Order of the Phoenix reveals the flaws in magical communication. Time and again, we see that messages in the wizarding world are delivered in the most unreliable ways possible. By owl, by Patronus, or by word of mouth. For a society built entirely on magic, this feels shockingly primitive. Wizards can teleport across continents, transform into animals, and preserve memories in liquid vials. Yet they communicate like medieval couriers. Consider how many disasters might have been avoided if wizards had a more secure system. Sirius's death, for example, hinges on miscommunication. Harry receives a false vision of him being tortured, and with no quick way to confirm the truth, he rushes to the Ministry. A simple enchanted mirror, the one Sirius gave him, could have solved the problem. But Harry never uses it, and the Order never establishes a backup system. Instead, they rely on owls that can be intercepted, and Patronus messages that only a select few seem to master. The problem isn't just about efficiency, it's about logic. If Dumbledore can send a howler that screams in someone's voice, why can't the Order send secure, unforgettable voice messages? If a marauder's map can reveal every person in Hogwarts in real time, why can't the Order develop a map of their own, safe houses? If magical portraits can talk and move between frames, why aren't they used as an instant messaging system across locations? The wizarding world is filled with examples of magical communication, yet in practice, the resistance against Voldemort relies on scraps of parchment and whispered rumors. Fans sometimes excuse this by pointing out that Voldemort's forces could intercept any magical network, making owls the safest form of delivery because they appear mundane. But that explanation only raises more questions. If Voldemort can intercept owls, why doesn't he exploit this constantly? And if he can't, then why treat owls as such a secure option? Once again, the rules bend depending on what the story needs, not on any coherent magical system. What's most striking is how selective these methods are. The Patronus communication charm, for instance, is used by only a handful of skilled witches and wizards. But if it's truly that powerful and secure, why isn't it taught to every member of the Order, or even to students? Why leave such an essential skill in the hands of only a few? The answer, of course, is narrative convenience. Rowling wants certain characters to shine, a message carried by Snape, a Patronus sent by Kingsley, so the ability remains rare, even though it makes little sense for the broader fight against Voldemort. In the end, the lack of reliable communication makes the wizarding world feel strangely small, as though people can only act when they're in the same room. And this flaw ties directly into another loophole. Not just how wizards communicate, but how they prepare for danger. Because if the Ministry can't build a consistent communication system, why should we expect them to build a consistent defense system? If communication exposes the wizarding world's lack of coordination, then Hogwarts itself exposes its lack of consistency. Again and again, we're told that the castle is the safest place in the magical world. brimming with enchantments so strong that even Voldemort hesitates to challenge them directly. No one can apparate inside, no one can bypass its protective spells, and the headmaster alone controls its defenses. But when we look closely, the security of Hogwarts is less fortress and more revolving door. Consider how many times the castle is breached. In Chamber of Secrets, the basilisk roams the school unchecked for months, petrifying students under Dumbledore's nose. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Sirius Black slips past Dementors and security charms to enter the castle multiple times. In Goblet of Fire, a Death Eater disguised as Moody infiltrates Hogwarts for an entire year, manipulating the Triwizard Tournament from the inside. And, in Half-Blood Prince, Draco Malfoy smuggles Death Eaters into the castle through a vanishing cabinet, leading directly to Dumbledore's death. For the most secure place in the wizarding world, Hogwarts is breached with alarming ease. The contradictions don't stop there. When the Ministry wants to interfere in Order of the Phoenix, Dolores Umbridge takes over as High Inquisitor, effectively usurping Dumbledore's authority. How can the supposed impregnable autonomy of the headmaster be overturned by bureaucratic decree? And during the Battle of Hogwarts, when the teachers finally raise every barrier and enchantment at their disposal, Voldemort's forces still find ways to penetrate the castle within hours. If the school can be breached so frequently, what exactly makes it safer than anywhere else? Fans often argue that Hogwarts isn't literally impenetrable, just highly defended, and that the breaches occur only through extraordinary circumstances. Animagy, enchanted objects, betrayal. But that defense weakens when you realize how often these extraordinary circumstances occur. Nearly every year, some new force threatens the students inside the castle. For a school meant to be the safest haven for young witches and wizards, Hogwarts consistently proves itself anything but. The problem is not just inconsistency, it's selectivity. Protections work when Rowling wants to keep characters in place, and they fail when she needs the danger to escalate. Hogwarts is unbreachable until, suddenly, it's not. The school is safe until, suddenly, it isn't. And the result is a fortress whose defenses collapse the moment the plot demands drama. This pattern of selective protection mirrors another magical inconsistency we've already seen. The Trace, which monitors underage magic, except when it doesn't. And if Hogwarts itself is riddled with loopholes, then perhaps it's no surprise that even the exams designed to measure magical skills suffer from the same problem. Which brings us to the OWL, LS, and NEWTs, tests that are supposed to define a wizard's entire future, yet somehow fail to measure half of what actually matters. If Hogwarts' defenses show us how the school fails to live up to its reputation as a fortress, its exams show us how it fails to live up to its reputation as a school. OLS and NEWTS are presented as the pinnacle of wizarding education, the tests that determine a student's entire career. We're told that without the right results, doors to jobs like Aura, Healer, or Ministry official slam shut. These exams are the gateway to the future, and yet, the way they're structured and enforced reveals more contradictions than consistency. For starters, OLLs and NEWTs focus heavily on written knowledge and practical demonstrations. But what about the countless magical skills never tested at all? Harry learns defensive spells and dueling tactics not from the classroom, but from Dumbledore's army. Hermione's time-turner-assisted schedule exposes how little flexibility there is in the curriculum, and Ron, who struggles academically, manages to scrape through with enough passes to still join the fight against Voldemort. If exams are supposed to determine competence, then how is it that so many crucial skills, Patronuses, nonverbal spells, even leadership, fall completely outside the testing system. The contradictions grow sharper when we see how these exams connect to careers. To become an Auror, students need top marks in several subjects. Yet, Harry, who barely scrapes and exceeds expectations in potions and never masters nonverbal magic in school, is still accepted into training. We're told standards are rigid, but then exceptions are made whenever the story needs a character to succeed. It leaves the exams feeling less like meaningful benchmarks and more like arbitrary obstacles that can be ignored when convenient. There's also the issue of fairness. Hermione, the brightest witch of her age, thrives in the exam environment. But what about students whose strengths lie outside memorization or spell repetition? Fred and George, for example, leave Hogwarts without completing their studies, yet build one of the most successful businesses in Diagon Alley. Their joke shop demonstrates creativity, entrepreneurship, and applied magical skill far beyond what an owl or newt could measure. So why is the system so rigid if it fails to account for talent like theirs? Fans sometimes argue that this inconsistency mirrors real life, that exams often fail to measure true intelligence or capability. And while that's true, the wizarding world presents owl and newts as absolute arbiters of fate, not flawed human institutions. The stakes are presented as too high for the logic to fall apart so icily. The exams are the supposed backbone of wizarding education, and yet they crumble the moment we compare their rules to the reality of wizarding life. And this brings us to another inconsistency that flows directly from Hogwarts' system of rules and punishments. If exams can be bent and careers reshaped around exceptions, then what about discipline at the school itself? Because when it comes to how Hogwarts punishes its students, we find a system so inconsistent it borders on the absurd. If OWLs and NEWTs show us how wizarding education fails to measure what matters, Hogwarts' disciplinary system shows us how it fails to enforce what matters. For a school so steeped in tradition, the rules for punishment are astonishingly inconsistent. One student might lose a few house points for sneaking out after curfew, while another faces life-threatening detention in the Forbidden Forest. The scale swings wildly, depending not on the crime, but on who happens to be in charge at the time. Consider Harry's first year. For being caught out of bed, he, Hermione, Neville, and Draco are sentenced to join Hagrid in the Forbidden Forest at night, where they stumble upon a hooded figure drinking unicorn blood. In other words, Voldemort himself. The punishment is not just excessive, it's reckless. How could sending children into the woods, where acromantulas, centaurs, and werewolves roam, possibly be considered an appropriate consequence for breaking curfew? Yet no one questions it, because the story needs Harry to encounter the villain. Contrast that with other moments. When Fred and George set off fireworks or collapse a corridor in protest of Umbridge, they're threatened with expulsion. When Harry publicly insults Snape, he faces weeks of detentions that leave his hand permanently scarred. But when Malfoy repeatedly tries to curse Harry in the hallways, or when Crabbe attempts to kill him with funfire in Deathly Hallows, the consequences vanish entirely. The system isn't just uneven, it's nonsensical. Even the house point system, meant to create a sense of fairness, is riddled with contradictions. In Philosopher's Stone, Dumbledore famously hands out last-minute points to Gryffindor to ensure they win the House Cup, essentially undermining the entire competition. In Order of the Phoenix, Umbridge weaponizes the system to punish Gryffindor disproportionately. Points, detentions, and suspensions become less about justice and more about who's in power at the moment. Fans sometimes excuse this by pointing out that Hogwarts is run by flawed human beings, not a perfect bureaucracy. But that defense only goes so far. This is supposed to be the finest magical school in the world, responsible for the safety and development of hundreds of children. If its disciplinary system is so erratic that punishments range from trivial to life-threatening, then the school isn't just inconsistent, it's negligent. And this negligence connects directly to the larger wizarding world. If Hogwarts can't enforce fair discipline, it's no wonder the Ministry of Magic operates with the same incompetence. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the justice system itself, where trials are rigged, evidence is ignored, and criminals escape with shocking ease. If punishment at Hogwarts feels arbitrary, the wizarding justice system feels downright broken. From the moment we're introduced to the Ministry of Magic's courts, it's clear that law and order in this world are less about fairness and more about fear, convenience, and corruption. The very institution meant to uphold justice is riddled with contradictions that make its authority collapse under scrutiny. Take Sirius Black. He is sent to Azkaban without a trial, imprisoned for over a decade, based on circumstantial evidence and public hysteria. No one investigates further, no one questions the narrative, and the Ministry never bothers to use Veritaserum or Legilimency to confirm the truth. Yet, later in the series, Veritaserum is presented as a reliable interrogation tool. And Legilimency is so common that Snape casually practices it on his students. If these methods exist, why weren't they used to prevent such a gross miscarriage of justice? The same pattern appears with Harry's trial in Order of the Phoenix. The Ministry summons him for using a Patronus in self-defense, dragging him into a full-scale hearing with the Wisegamot. Meanwhile, underage magic by others is ignored, and Death Eaters roam free without consequence. The contrast makes the justice system look less like law and more like theater, weaponized against political enemies while ignoring genuine threats. Even the methods of punishment highlight contradictions. Azkaban is portrayed as the most terrifying prison imaginable, guarded by Dementors who literally drain prisoners of hope. Yet, by Deathly Hallows, the prison is effectively emptied as the Dementors join Voldemort, freeing Death Eaters en masse. If Azkaban's security rests entirely on creatures that can switch allegiances, then it was never secure in the first place. And what does it say about wizarding society that they rely on such cruel and unstable guards? Fans sometimes argue that the wizarding justice system is meant to reflect the flaws of our own world. Corruption, incompetence, prejudice, and while that may be thematically true, it doesn't explain the internal inconsistencies. If Veritaserum exists, why allow false convictions? If magical contracts are binding, why not enforce them in trials? If memory charms can preserve evidence, why is testimony so unreliable? The tools for a fair and consistent legal system exist, but Rowling chooses not to use them because fairness would remove too many narrative obstacles. The result is a world where justice bends as easily as the rules at Hogwarts. Punishments vary not by the crime, but by the needs of the plot. Sirius rots in prison without trial. Harry faces the Wisegamot for defending himself, and Death Eaters repeatedly escape, only to be caught again when the story demands it. It's a system that doesn't function because it was never built to. It was built to create drama. And with this, we've now uncovered 25 loopholes in the wizarding world. It's the perfect time to pause again, to reflect on what we've seen in this third stretch of chapters, before we push forward to the final 5. At this stage, we've uncovered 25 loopholes in the Harry Potter series, and what's striking is how much broader the cracks have become. In the first stretch of our journey, the inconsistencies centered on objects and spells. In the second, they revolved around power and destiny. But here, in this third act, The loopholes have expanded to institutions themselves, the very structures of wizarding society. We began with communication, a system so outdated it relies on owls and whispers, while ignoring the countless magical tools that could have provided security and speed. From there, we turned to Hogwarts itself, the school billed as the safest place in the wizarding world, and saw how easily it was breached year after year. Then we examined OLs and NEWTs, the exams that supposedly determine futures, but fail to measure the very skills that matter most. After that, we looked at Hogwarts discipline, where punishments swing from trivial to life-threatening without rhyme or reason. And finally, we explored the wizarding justice system, a system that imprisons without trial, ignores reliable truth-finding spells, and depends on Dementors whose loyalty collapses when it matters most. What all of these loopholes reveal is that the inconsistencies are no longer just about plot convenience, they are systemic. The wizarding world doesn't just bend its rules when convenient. It has no rules that hold up under scrutiny at all. Education, discipline, law, and order all unravel when tested, leaving a society that seems incapable of functioning beyond the narrow scope of Harry's story. And now, as we prepare to explore the final 5 loopholes, our focus will shift once again. We've seen the cracks in spells, objects, and institutions. Next, we'll examine the contradictions in characters themselves, their choices, their logic, and the ways their actions undermine the very world they inhabit. Because sometimes, the biggest loopholes aren't in the magic at all, but in the people who wield it. If the justice system revealed the flaws in wizarding institutions, then Severus Snape reveals the flaws in wizarding character logic. For much of the series, Snape is a figure of mystery, cruel but brilliant, petty yet brave, despised by Harry yet secretly working to protect him. In the final book, Rowling reframes him as a tragic hero, a man whose love for Lily Potter defined his every choice. It's a powerful twist, but one that collapses under scrutiny. Snape's contradictions begin with his role as a double agent. We're told he convinces Voldemort of his loyalty, while secretly serving Dumbledore, passing information to both sides. But how does this hold up when Voldemort is a master legilimens, capable of reading minds and uncovering lies? If Snape truly hated Harry as much as he pretended, wouldn't that have bled into his thoughts? And if his love for Lily drove his loyalty to Dumbledore, how could he keep that from a Dark Lord who specialized in exposing hidden truths? The books never resolve this paradox. Instead, they ask us to accept Snape's duplicity as flawless, even though it should have been impossible under Voldemort's scrutiny. Then there's the contradiction of his treatment of Harry. We're told Snape protects Harry out of devotion to Lily. Yet he spends years humiliating him, belittling him, and sometimes endangering him. It's hard to reconcile the man who risked his life to shield Harry from Voldemort with the man who left him bleeding in a classroom after a cruel insult. If Snape's love was so deep, why didn't it manifest in even the smallest gestures of kindness? The explanation that Snape despised Harry for looking like James doesn't erase the fact that Lily's child was repeatedly traumatized by the very man who swore to keep him safe. Even Snape's supposed heroism at the end raises contradictions. We're told that his death is noble, his memories a gift to Harry that reveals the truth. But those memories also show how much pain could have been avoided if Snape had simply spoken sooner. If he had told Harry about the Horcruxes earlier, or explained Dumbledore's plan directly, lives might have been saved. Instead, Snape withholds the truth until his dying breath, forcing Harry to learn at the 11th hour what he should have known much earlier. Fans defend this by saying Snape was deeply flawed, that his cruelty was intentional. his secrecy necessary, and his contradictions part of what made him human. And while that may be true from a character perspective, it doesn't erase the loopholes his actions create. For a man who is supposed to embody both love and loyalty, his behavior often undermines both. Snape is presented as a hero, but his contradictions leave us questioning whether he was truly heroic at all, or simply another flawed adult whose choices put Harry in unnecessary danger. And speaking of contradictions in character, Snape is not alone. The next major figure whose decisions strain logic is none other than Voldemort himself. A villain so obsessed with domination that he repeatedly makes choices that weaken his own position. If Snape's contradictions reveal the cracks in a so-called hero, Voldemort's contradictions reveal the cracks in a villain. He is introduced as the most feared dark wizard of all time, a genius who bends magic to his will, a strategist who builds an army capable of shaking the wizarding world to its core. And yet, when we look closely, his choices often undermine his own goals, turning his brilliance into something far less impressive. Consider his obsession with prophecy. Voldemort hears a fragment of a prediction, and, instead of ignoring it or seeking clarification, he builds his entire strategy around destroying a child. In doing so, he fulfills the very prophecy he was trying to avoid, marking Harry as his equal and creating the conditions for his own downfall. A truly cunning villain might have dismissed the prophecy as unreliable or turned his attention elsewhere. Instead, Voldemort becomes a prisoner of it, trapped by his own interpretation. Then there's his approach to power. Voldemort surrounds himself with Death Eaters, yet he rules them through fear rather than loyalty. He punishes failure with cruelty, crippling his own ranks by breeding paranoia instead of unity. When Lucius Malfoy loses the diary in Chamber of Secrets, Voldemort humiliates him rather than motivating him to recover. When his followers fail at the Department of Mysteries, he abandons them, ensuring their loyalty is always shaky at best. For a man who craves control, he creates an army that serves him only out of fear, a system that inevitably collapses the moment he shows weakness. Even Voldemort's use of Horcruxes is riddled with contradiction. His supposed genius leads him to split his soul into 7 pieces. Yet he places them in locations that are either too obvious, like the diary in the hands of a schoolgirl, or too exposed, like Nagini slithering at his side. He mocks Dumbledore for valuing love and underestimates Harry's resilience. But in reality, his downfall stems less from Harry's power and more from his own sloppy execution. Fans often defend these contradictions by saying Voldemort is blinded by arrogance, that his inability to love or trust explains why he makes mistakes. And while this works thematically, it doesn't erase the practical flaws. A truly cunning villain would have guarded his Horcruxes better, used prophecy to his advantage, and built an army with genuine loyalty. Instead, Voldemort repeatedly sabotages himself, allowing Harry and his friends opportunities they should never have had. Ultimately, Voldemort's contradictions transform him from a terrifying mastermind into something less intimidating, a tyrant undone by his own short-sightedness. His flaws make for an effective story, but they also expose the cracks in the logic of his supposed genius. And if Voldemort's contradictions undermine his role as a villain, then the next set of contradictions belong to the very community he seeks to dominate. The Wizarding Society itself, a culture so insular and illogical that it often seems to set itself up for collapse. If Voldemort's contradictions reveal the flaws of a single man, the contradictions of Wizarding Society reveal the flaws of an entire culture. From the very beginning, Rowling paints the wizarding world as vibrant, hidden, and steeped in tradition, a parallel society operating alongside the Muggle one. But the more we examine it, the more it collapses under its own weight. For a world supposedly thriving in secrecy for centuries, the logic holding it together feels increasingly thin. Start with the statute of secrecy itself. Wizards live in hiding, forbidden to reveal magic to Muggles, yet they constantly interact with the non-magical world in ways that should expose them. The night bus barrels through London at impossible speeds, Muggles somehow never noticing. Quidditch matches involve hundreds of wizards flying on broomsticks, yet the Ministry insists they can keep these hidden with a few charms. Even Hogwarts, a castle filled with explosions, fireworks, and flying creatures, somehow remains invisible to the outside world. If wizarding secrecy is so fragile that one broken spell could expose everything, how has it lasted this long? Then there's the economy. Wizards use galleons, sickles, and nuts, a monetary system so outdated it makes no sense beside modern economies. How does an entire society sustain itself with no clear industry beyond joke shops, broomsticks, and owl delivery? Where are the farms that grow wizarding food, the factories that craft cauldrons, the infrastructure that supports an entire hidden population? The books show us Diagon Alley as the bustling heart of commerce, but scratch beneath the surface and the system appears unsustainable. The contradictions run deeper when we consider technology. Wizards avoid electricity, preferring quills to pens and candles to light bulbs. Yet they master magic powerful enough to split souls and resurrect the dead. We're told they disdain Muggle inventions, but time and again Muggle tools would solve their problems faster than spells. Radios, telephones, even simple record-keeping systems would have saved lives. The refusal to adopt them isn't just arrogance. It makes the wizarding world look deliberately backward, as though it is allergic to practicality. And then there is the issue of governance. The Ministry of Magic is presented as the central authority, but it operates with shocking inefficiency. Leadership changes hands in moments of crisis, with no clear system of accountability. Elections are never mentioned, representation is unclear, and corruption festers unchecked. The society that claims to preserve order instead perpetuates chaos, a contradiction so glaring it undermines the very idea of stability in the wizarding world. Fans sometimes argue that these flaws are intentional, that Rowling meant for the wizarding world to reflect the messiness of human society. And while that may be true on a symbolic level, it doesn't erase the logical gaps. If the world is so inconsistent in secrecy, economy, and governance, then it's hard to believe it could have endured for centuries at all. And this brings us to the final cracks in the foundation, not in Voldemort, not in the Ministry, but in the very premise of wizarding life. The reliance on magic itself. Because if magic can do anything, then why does it so often seem to do nothing? If wizarding society's contradictions expose the cracks in its structure, then the limits of magic expose the cracks in its very foundation. From the very beginning, magic is presented as limitless, a force that can transform, heal, summon, protect, and destroy. Wands are extensions of will. Spells are tools for any situation, and the possibilities seem endless. And yet, again and again, the story places arbitrary limits on magic that feel less like natural laws and more like narrative convenience. Consider death. Wizards can brew potions to grant near immortality, split souls to tether themselves to life, and even summon shades of the dead through Priori Incontem, or the Resurrection Stone. And yet, we're told that no magic can bring back the dead. But if that's true, then what exactly are we seeing when Harry meets his parents in the graveyard, or when he walks to his own death and the shades of James, Lily, Sirius, and Remus walk beside him? The boundary between life and death is presented as absolute until it suddenly blurs. Then there's healing. Madame Pomfrey can mend bones overnight, regrow skin, and cure poisoning with a potion. But when it comes to more permanent injuries, like George's lost ear or Mad Eye's missing eye, magic suddenly fails. If spells can regrow bones, why not an ear? If enchanted prosthetics exist, why are they so rare? The limits of magical medicine seem to expand or contract depending entirely on the scene, leaving us unsure of what magic truly can or cannot do. Even everyday spells highlight contradictions. The Trace is supposed to monitor underage magic, but only in some cases. Apparition is supposed to be tightly regulated, yet wizards apparate into secure spaces all the time. Polyjuice Potion allows near-perfect disguise, yet somehow can't fool everyone when the plot requires it. The list goes on. Spells that are all-powerful until they aren't. Potions that work perfectly until they don't. The rules of magic shift constantly, and the story never establishes a consistent framework. Fans often defend this by saying magic is unpredictable, that its limits are mysterious and beyond full comprehension. And while that may work as an aesthetic choice, it undermines the logic of the world. If magic can both solve everything and solve nothing, then it becomes less a system and more a handwave, a tool that bends to whatever the author needs in the moment. And this brings us to the final loophole of all, not about objects, institutions, or even magic itself, but about the central story at the heart of the series. Because, when we strip away the contradictions, the biggest question remains. Why did Harry need to suffer at all? If the limits of magic expose the fragility of the wizarding world's foundation, then the question of Harry's suffering exposes the fragility of its story. From the very beginning, Harry is positioned as the chosen one, destined to face Voldemort, burdened with a prophecy, and marked by fate. But as we've seen through every loophole, the logic that forces him down this path is riddled with contradictions. And the greatest of these contradictions is simple. Why did Harry have to endure so much pain, if so many of the obstacles in his way existed only because of oversight, secrecy, or narrative convenience? Harry spends 11 years abused by the Dursleys, even though magical guardians like Dumbledore, McGonagall, or Hagrid could have intervened. He spends 7 years fighting dangers at Hogwarts, even though the school is supposedly the safest place in the world. He is lied to, manipulated, and withheld from. Told too late about Horcruxes, too late about the prophecy, too late about his connection to Voldemort. Again and again, adults who claimed to protect him instead left him to stumble through danger blind. And in the end, the solution to defeating Voldemort, Harry's willing sacrifice, was something that could have been explained to him far earlier, sparing him the confusion, fear, and despair that haunted him until the last possible moment. The story frames this suffering as necessary. Dumbledore insists that Harry must learn resilience, that love and choice must be freely embraced, not forced. And narratively, that theme is powerful. But when we weigh it against the loopholes we've uncovered, it begins to feel less like destiny and more like negligence. Harry didn't need to suffer nearly as much as he did. He suffered because the world around him was inconsistent, because the adults who should have guided him withheld truth, and because the rules of magic bent themselves to create obstacles where none needed to exist. In the end, Harry triumphs, but not because the wizarding world made sense, or because the rules held steady. He triumphs because the story bent itself around him, closing loopholes only when it was convenient and leaving him to carry the weight the rest of the time. His suffering was real, but its necessity was not. And so we close the book on 30 loopholes in the Harry Potter series. From the invisibility of the Dursleys' abuse to the Elder Wand's contradictions. From the fragility of Hogwarts' defenses to the collapse of the justice system. From the limits of magic itself to the suffering of the Chosen One. We've seen how a world that enchanted millions is also riddled with cracks. But perhaps that is the final paradox of Rowling's creation. The very inconsistencies that weaken its logic are also what make it so endlessly fascinating. Fans debate the Triwizard Tournament's rules, the Horcrux's destruction, the Marauders' map, and Snape's motives, not because the answers are clear, but because they aren't. The loopholes frustrate us, but they also keep the story alive long after the last page is turned. Harry Potter's world may not be watertight. Its rules may wobble, its institutions may collapse, and its magic may contradict itself. But in the end, that imperfection is part of its spell. We question, we argue, we laugh at its loopholes, and yet we return, again and again, to the boy who lived. Because, even when the logic falters, the magic lingers. And that wraps up today's deep dive into the loopholes of the wizarding world. Before you drift off, I'll leave you with an hour of calming nature sounds and soft music to guide you into sleep. So feel free to close your eyes, relax, and let the magic fade into dreams. But, if you'd rather keep exploring, you can click the video in the top right corner, Harry Potter's Diary, for another journey into the hidden corners of the story. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which Harry Potter movie is your favorite, and why? I can't wait to see your answers. Until next time, sleep well, and stay curious.